Hello, and welcome to the Chicago Humanities Festival and today's program, Forrest Stewart and Kathy Cohen, Black Youth and Political Agency in the 21st Century. My name is C. Riley Snorton, and I am the Interim Faculty Director of the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, CSRPC. Since its inception in 1996, the center has been committed to establishing and sustaining a space to center and expand the study of race and ethnicity at the University of Chicago by fostering interdisciplinary, transnational, and intersectional research, teaching, and public debate. At the center, we understand that race and ethnicity affect every idea and interaction, and we work to foster meaningful dialogue about the myriad ways race and ethnicity inform our lived experiences and scholarship. We at CSRPC are proud to partner with the Chicago Humanities Festival on what promises to be an urgent and lively conversation. You can learn more about upcoming events at chicagohumanities.org and help support them by donating or becoming a member. Thanks to our captioner for making this event more accessible. All digital events have closed captioning, which can be controlled through YouTube. You can learn more about accessible services at chicagohumanities.org/access. This week's programs are presented with the support of Bank of America. Please help me in welcoming Kathy Cohen and Forrest Stewart.
Well, good afternoon, Forrest. How are you?
I'm well. It's so wonderful to see you, Kathy. It's been too long.
I was going to say the same thing. It's a pleasure to be here with you to have a discussion about what I think is a really important and insightful book. I so enjoyed reading the book, Ballad of the Bullet. Also, congrats on your recently announced MacArthur Genius Award. You're looking like a genius there.
Is this what it looks like? Okay,
I don't
cool.
know. I don't know. Those of us who aren't geniuses, we don't know. No.
Oh gosh.
I want to, I have to tease you a little. So I have to ask first, like, how's your life changed with the publication of the book and the announcement of the award?
Well, I mean, I will say, something really interesting happened, and I'd be curious to hear from you if you've experienced similar things. Your career has been amazing. There's a lot less. I feel like folks are more willing to take some of my seemingly outrageous claims about young Black folks, without me having to do quite as much work to convince them that like I might actually have a point in the things that I'm saying, that like, they're like, okay, yeah, I can maybe believe you a little bit more now that like the book is out and this MacArthur has happened, which is both frustrating and it is what it is, I guess.
Exactly. You've been validated by the outside. Right? So now your insights about young Black people might be accurate. I think it's also maybe a gendered positionality, in the sense of, do I feel validated about my insights about Black people? I think there's a lot of people who just don't care. So they're like, okay, whatever you say. But for those who do, I think the longer you do it, the more people are willing to say, maybe that work is accurate. Or,
Yeah. I think so. And I think you nailed it. You nailed it there.
Right. We'll see. So I wanna start with, and this is going to be a back and forth, but really,
please.
A fourth is going to be a fourth more than a back and forth. With a kind of high level summary of the book for folks who haven't had a chance to read the book. And at the heart of this book, for me, at least my reading of it, there were just kind of critical subjects that I thought, yes, right? So helping us think maybe differently or evolve our understanding of urban poverty from the Wilson era, or, how does what many feminists, I consider myself a Black feminist, think about, which is masculinity, hypermasculinity, the performance of masculinity, that is a part of the book. Art and performance, you remind us to center art, and these young men are artists. Something we'll talk about in a minute, which is the affordances of social media, right? All over the book. I would contend you don't use the language of racial capitalism, but you could argue this is a project about racial capitalism. So,
Yes.
and I want to applaud you for like making sure all of those theoretical anchors and concepts were there, because I think to tell a nuanced story about young Black people, you need those types of anchors. So, so for all of the people who haven't had a chance to read the book, who will, and who are now like, okay, he covers all of that in one book. How would you describe the main arguments in the book? And we'll go deeper into that. And, you know, or a couple of main takeaways that you would want people to say, this is what I was trying to do in the book.
Absolutely. And thank you so much. I am so pleased to hear that even if I haven't used some of these concepts like racial capitalism explicitly in the book, that like it's there, right? Like
Yes.
you can read it. You can read it in the book. The kinds of I maybe see where my politics are. You can maybe see where my kind of intellectual stance is, and so maybe that's a good place to start, which is maybe why I wrote this book. In terms one of the reasons why I wrote this book, and I hope that we can get into some more of these. You know, one of them was about this dearth that I had seen in the ways in which young Black folks online and digital behaviors had been talked about. I know at the beginning of this project, you were immensely helpful for me in making me feel like, oh, I'm not crazy. It's like there's no one's speaking about this. Not that folks weren't speaking about young Black folks as like contributors. They just like, for me, they weren't really speaking about them whatsoever. And there was such this kind of deficit approach, right? That like this notion of this digital divide just kind of left, you know, Black youth out of our conversations in terms of who is making valuable things online. And so I think I wrote this book in large part because if we look around the globe right now, I mean, I think the pandemic definitely brought this out. Like, who is driving all of like the TikTok dances and the SoundCloud music and like the memes on Instagram? It's like, it's young Black folks, I would argue, are driving so much of this. And certainly for sociologists, we hadn't really thought about this. And so I wanted to, you know, one of the many things I wanted to do was create some kind of grounded articulation of like what is actually happening, to what extent are young folks creating, and in ways that maybe are complex and messy and difficult to get our heads around. And it just so happened, I think maybe this is because I come at this as like an urban poverty scholar, as a crime scholar. I developed this incredible intimate access to a gang on the South Side, a gang faction on the South Side, who, like, it turns out around like 70% or more now at this point in time of gangs on the South Side had turned into essentially rap groups, and were competing in this digital economy, making these kind of DIY gangster raps that they were putting up on YouTube, and then using all the kinds of different social media that surrounds it to try to kind of convey authenticity, to kind of build these online brands, in the hopes of attracting like the attention of gatekeepers, you know, Interscope Records, who would swoop into the South Side. This was the narrative, the kind of mythology. They'll swoop into the South Side. You've got 1 million views or 2 on your YouTube page. You've got like 50,000 followers on your Instagram. You've now crowdsourced our A&R, so we're going to sign you up for a $6 million deal. We're going to fly you to Los Angeles. We're going to put you up in a mansion. And so what we saw was, like, you know, what I describe in the book is this spread of this new mode of, or at least new aspiration for upward mobility, a new vehicle for upward mobility that young folks across Chicago, and now I'm seeing like across the globe, in London, in Paris, and in Australia, are taking up. And I argue in the book in large part because, you know, we've seen this intergenerational erosion of opportunities, both in the formal economy and the informal economy. And in its place has come the digital economy. And young people, I think quite unsurprisingly, are turning to this. And you know, I'll stop with a high level summary here, but I think the Wilson point, can I touch on the Wilson?
Go.
Just one last bit.
Yes.
So I think as sociologists, we've had this notion, and I think, you know, Bill Wilson provided, I think, some really important and game-changing analyses in the late 80s and 1990s, which really kind of showed that so much of the dislocation and so much of the difficulties that urban communities, urban poor Black communities, particularly in Chicago, are facing, has a lot to do with these structural impediments, right? We can think about like the industrial manufacturing center economy kind of bottoming out, right? And so I think it was really important, but the more that I think about the digital spaces that young people are in, the more I realized like it was just totally not giving us the ability to talk about what was going on now, that it really talked about communities like the ones I'm interested in and I write about as like unproductive, highly unproductive. And it's in their unproductiveness that like all these problems happen, right? It's almost like they're not, I mean, there's an image of like they're not contributing to society in a meaningful way. But what's interesting is once you look on like the cultural production side and the digital cultural production side, you see that like these communities are some of our most intense and exciting hotbeds of production but it's in the cultural realm, in the digital cultural realm, if not in like the industrial manufacturing realm. Yeah, and so I'm really just trying to tell this story through the lens of these young men.
Okay, so that was amazing, and I could follow it all because, in fact, I've read the book, and I mean, I think it speaks to the complexity of the book, right? That there's a lot going on. So let's peel back
Okay.
some of these, and then go a little more in depth. So first of all, the
Yeah.
book is really kind of situated around drill music, right?
Mm-hmm.
Drillers, and so can you explain to the audience? Um, the significance of this phenomenon, which is different than rap music or gangster rap. Um, Although we can say that music and rap music in particular, as a kind of, as you would say, a kind of creative site of production for young Black people, has continuously been important, and I would argue underestimated in terms of its significance of both generating those kind of dreams of celebrity, which you talk about, kind of, and we'll get to this idea of micro celebrity. Um, you know, with digital affordances, and you talk about this, we get to kind of at some points go around gatekeepers, but not completely. And so
Right.
all of this complicates our understanding of how people can be creative, how they can control destiny, right? But the structural difficulties that they still confront. So let's start with, I dare say, Chief Keef and drill music. And I don't like.
Yes, this classic song.
The classic song. How does that kind of set this on fire, so to speak?
Yeah. So Chief Keef is kind of like the patron saint, like the role model that folks look to in this whole drill music genre. And we can't talk about Chief Keef without kind of understanding what drill is exactly. And drill in some respects is a kind of continuation of the kind of gangster rap that we have seen, right, since like NWA and, you know, all through the years, where it's, you know, the images of kind of street life, street hustling, drug dealing, murder, trauma are certainly prevalent, but I think drill is different, and just for those who don't know, drill is slang for shooting, to shoot someone. So this is like shooting music. I think it's different in for many reasons, but for one big reason, that it's like no longer do young people have to try to get access to big studios or record labels, or, you know, the biggest gatekeepers, in order to get millions and millions of people to hear their music. That something has happened with the kind of mass democratization of the means of cultural production, right? That with an iPhone, with cheap software that sometimes you could even do on your phone, on your smartphone, or on a cheap laptop that you can get for free, kind of open source software, you know, with the fact that you can now host, you know, videos, high quality videos online, that young people have said, hey, I can do this kind of stuff myself. You know, I've got a buddy, we can stand around, videotape each other, we can record some raps. And so there's been this mass democratization of the ability to do this stuff. And we really see this, Chief Keef becomes like this story that we have to tell to show just how powerful this thing is. And so Chief Keef, right around 2011, he's making this kind of stuff. He's a young man. I think at the time he was maybe 16, 17. He's kind of in and around the kind of Englewood neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. And after some run-ins with the police, he is on house arrest, like at his grandmother's house. And he decides, like, I'm going to start making some more of these videos from my grandmother's house, from her living room. And so he gathers his buddies, he gets a guy to shoot this video, and he records this song called Don't Like, I Don't Like. And it's, you know, him and his friend shirtless, jumping around, you know, talking about, like, you know, either shooting people or, you know, the kinds of things that they don't like, you know, snitches and all kinds of folks. And this video just blows up. It goes totally viral. And one of the analyses that others have done around this video, that I kind of agree with, is that there was something that this video did that almost, like, for those folks who had never like set foot in a place like Englewood, and we're talking about like middle class white audiences, they like got this what felt was this like authentic glimpse into the ghetto that like they couldn't have gotten previously.
Well,
And
can we also
yes,
say it confirmed their ideas of what happens in the ghetto, right? A bunch of young
right.
Black men, shirts off, smoking blunts and
Mhm.
rapping. That's the ghetto today. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And you know, this is a big part of the drill kind of thing, is that it sways heavy on the side of not just confirming, but I would say exaggerating the kinds
Mm.
of stereotypes, right, that have been thrown onto urban Black communities. I mean, for as long as we can remember, and on urban Black men for as long as we can remember. And in fact, you know, some of the drillers who I spent some time with acknowledge this, that they say, you know, like, people love to see, right, the hypes walking down the street, and they love to see the guns, and they love to see the drugs. They love to hear me talking about street life, to the point where, like, when they're in their neighborhood shooting music videos, you know, they're like, oh, you know, here comes an addict walking up the street, like, film the addict, film the addict. Or like, oh, there's a pit bull, like my neighbor's got a pit bull, film the pit bull, film the pit bull.
Exactly.
You know, and guns, and it's like, oh, you know, like, let me get my buddy who's, you know, incarcerated to call my phone right now, and we'll accept the collect call, so like we can put him on the video. So it's like pit bulls, addicts, incarceration, you know, young folks really trying to exaggerate these. And in some respect, like, I find it kind of unsurprising, and I think it's one of the
Mm.
things I hope I pull out in the book, in that, um, you know, like, there's been a market for this stuff for a very long time. You know, interestingly, I don't write about this in the book, but I was doing this work when Spike Lee, a New Yorker, no less, right, parachuted into the south side of Chicago
Yes.
to film Chirac.
Right.
And what
Exactly.
is Chirac, right? Chirac is a movie about drill. It's a movie about drillers, that it's about young men shooting each other over raps and other kinds of, what's played up as essentially petty or trivial things that they shouldn't be shooting each other
Mhm.
over.
Mhm.
And during the filming of that, during the end of the filming, I was actually sitting like down the street with one of the young men who's in the book. And he said, you know, like, this is BS. Like, why should he be able to profit off of these caricatures of me? That, like, if anybody's going to, like, you know, do Spike Lee's Chirac, like, shouldn't it be me? Like, shouldn't it be the person who, like, actually, you know, is closer to this life?
Right.
Yeah, so
Right.
it's quite intentional, this exaggeration of this
Well, there are like three things that came up while you were speaking. So
stuff.
I just hope the audience can hang with us as we go back and forth, back and forth.
Oh,
One
okay.
is the way in which this is very much a book about young Black men on the South Side who live in poverty, who are gang
Mhm.
affiliated, gang associated, gang involved. But it's also about, and you were just speaking to this, I call it the kind of ecology of drill, right? That there
Mm,
are we might call them enablers. And you talk about this in the book, right? The story about Chad is hilarious, but right, that there are
And
people,
tragic, and
yes,
tragic.
and tragic. So there are people who are voyeuristic. There are Black people who are positioning themselves against them, right, as from middle class respectability. There's also a whole kind of informal organizational structure that is a part of this. And so there are these two, at the very least, two levels through which to read this book, right? About the young Black men who you focus on, but really also about a larger society that has limited their opportunity for mobility to the kind of caricature of stereotypes that feed their understanding of what Blackness and poverty looks like. Okay, so I want to talk about that in a minute, but first I want to talk about social media, because in your story of Chief Keef, in your story of these young men who are looking and participating in the online attention economy, you say, right? It's all based on this idea that, in fact, there's been a democratization, you say, of the kind of digital world, right? Social media is available. You can do all sorts of things with a cell phone. And so I want to hear your thoughts about kind of the affordances of social media, or what we used to call new media, is now digital media, right? The absence of gatekeepers and all of that.
Yeah.
But at the same
yeah.
time, you bring us back and say, well, there's also digital disadvantage, right? Which is different than the digital divide. So let's start with the affordances of social media, which you said a bit about, and kind of what this allows these young men to do. But then we have to put it into perspective with this idea of digital disadvantage.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that this is a difficulty that I wrestled with a lot. And I think I end up in a place where I kind of am really pushing back on the what we could call like the techno optimists, right? Who I think are
Yes.
really invested in this notion that, like, oh, you've democratized the means of cultural production. Well, then anybody can, one, make it big, or two,
Yeah.
even like just like join the public discourse, right? And join the public discourse in a meaningful, genuine kind of way. And so for me, and I think in this book, I'm trying to say, like, whoa, let's pump the brakes on this. That democratization, that proliferation of these new tools into the hands of marginalized, neglected communities is not touching down in a kind of power-free, equal setting, right? And I think one of the ways, and it's been something I've been having a hard time getting my head around, how we show that kind of process and what the stakes are in that process. And so for me, I think what I've tried to do is to say, sure, the means of putting out a commodifiable persona out there online, we can all do it. But what is the persona? What is the content that different groups are allowed to do, and are allowed to do in a way where, like, the public believes them, right? Believes that it is authentic, right? So like there's a set of things that I could do online that people would be like, oh yeah, I believe him. Like, he talked about a new paper that he put out. He, is talking about his book. But if I'm out there, I don't know, talking about like cross-country skiing or something like that, like, I doubt like anybody's necessarily going to believe me. And so I think that's kind of a trivial, silly example.
I'd believe you. Yes. That's right.
Okay,
You can ski.
Well, that's good. So I will do the cross-country skiing.
I believe you can ski. There you go.
I actually I cannot ski, actually.
Okay,
But yeah, so these young men, I think we have to ask the question of, like, what is the online commodity that they can sell most efficiently, most profitably, most convincingly. And I think that that's where the rubber meets the road in terms of this notion of digital disadvantage, right? That's like, these guys look around and they ask themselves, like, what is the thing the public wants from me that I can do most easily? And honestly, it's quite easy for them to portray themselves as this kind of mythical Black super predator, precisely because, right, folks look at them online, whether they have guns or not, whether they have drugs or not, like, they're already going to be assuming, certain kind of racial stereotypes. And so they're essentially, put in a position where that becomes the most commodifiable, effective, piece of content for them to put online.
Can I, there,
Yeah.
you made a kind of critical intervention, and I want to make sure folks that we're all kind of struggling with this, right? Which is,
Yeah.
first of all, the framework of the digital divide often was about equipment, having done some
Mhm.
of that work. Who owns
Yeah.
laptops and who owns smartphones? And when that framework started, it really was because you could do much more with a laptop than you could with a cell phone or a
Right.
smartphone. And now you can do just as much with a smartphone, sometimes more than you can do with a laptop. And so the digital divide, it seems, doesn't fully take us to where you're taking us in this book. There's also the question of production versus control. So when you mentioned before,
Mm,
who are people watching on TikTok? They're watching a lot of dances or things that young Black people produce, but they don't control it in terms of
yes.
being monetized by it. And it seems to me that the young men in your book are saying, yeah, I could be, I mean, they probably would not be a part of like Black Twitter or something, right? Like I could be a part of something that produces, but what I want is control, right? I want to be monetized for my
Mhm.
labor or for my performance or for my neighborhood. And that becomes a different way of thinking about their engagement with technology and this idea of a kind of digital disadvantage, because it's not about equipment, right?
Right.
It's about the ways in which I think you talked about technology interacting with poverty. It
Hmm.
says
Hmm.
that, it's the intersection of race and class in the framework of technology. And how does that
Right.
change how we think about technology?
Right. Right. Yeah. And I wrestled, and I think it's certainly during this pandemic right now where we're seeing growing gaps, right, between students who have technology and students who don't. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that like the digital divide is important and it's real, and I think it's exacerbated, but I also think
Right.
that it's limited in terms of like how it can help us like understand new forms of inequality that are happening as a result of and kind of exacerbated by the turn to kind of these digital tools and digital modes of production. And I mean, I think I might say something slightly different.
Good. Good.
What the digital divide is concerned about, right, is access. And what I think what I want to shift our conversation to, and why I offer this notion of the digital disadvantage, is that I want to think more about stakes and options. Right. So we can think about what are the stakes of getting, let's put a number on it. What are the stakes of getting 1 million views on your YouTube video for, say, a middle class kid on the north side and a young, poor Black man who's, living and crushing poverty on the south side? Well, for this young man, relates into some things that really matter for his life, right? So it's, if that can get someone at school in the lunchroom to like loan him $50, like this
Mm.
is a young man who perhaps, I mean, I hate to like even like yeah, there's something about this that makes me uncomfortable, but right. So like the young men who I hung out with, like, they're eating, Jay's potato chips for breakfast because they're broke, right? So like
Mhm.
$50 because somebody thinks that like you're popular online is like the difference between like not eating and eating, which I just think is qualitatively different in terms of what the stakes are for a young
Yes.
person growing up in a middle class household for whom that YouTube channel or that YouTube video can be cast as kind of a hobby, right, in terms of the
Mhm.
rewards. But then I think also in terms of stakes, in terms of the negative costs, right? So for that young person on the north side, there is very little risk that a cop that he is going to get wrapped up in the criminal justice system, and somehow that YouTube video is going to be implicated in his arrest, in his sentencing, in his pretrial release decision. But for young Black men on the south side, like every single court case, right, his
Mhm.
YouTube is on trial as well, his
Mhm.
Facebook is on trial, his Instagram is on trial, to the point where now, like, images of him holding a gun are brought in front of a jury or brought to the plea deal, whether or not he's facing a gun charge, right? Whether
Mhm.
or not, he's being sentenced for a gun, right? That gun on Instagram is showing up. And so I think that this gives us a different kind of tool to think about the stakes. And so, yeah, so I think
Mm.
stakes is the really big one. And then also, um, that those media is seen differently by society, right? So like
Right.
if we had both of these people, the middle class white kid on the north side posting a gun,
Mm.
black kid on the south side posting a gun, one of those, and I think we know which one, is going to be seen as juvenile mistake, like let's wrap our arms around this person. Or if he threatens someone, it's like it's
Mhm.
just words, he would never act on that. Young man on the south side, it's like, oh, he must be a killer. Like, who else?
Mhm.
Why else would he put a gun on his social media? Like, he must be out there shooting people in the streets. We need to arrest him. We need to lock him up. He's a menace to society. And so yeah. So I think it's different than a digital
Mhm.
divide.
Mhm. No, I think that's absolutely right. So, Forrest, there's another area that you've already talked about that I want to come back to, and it's you haven't used the language, but it's so prominent in the book. It's this idea of micro celebrity, right, on the online attention economy. And part of the way we could understand micro celebrity, right, is the Chief Keef trajectory that everybody wants a big contract. They want to make the big money. I think about it as kind of basketball dreams, right? Everybody wants to be signed by the NBA so they can change the lives of their families and themselves. But you also do really great work in thinking about the rewards for micro celebrity in terms of just the day to day for folks, right? It is, do I eat? Can I buy diapers for my kid? Um, just the basics. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about micro celebrity, but also the rewards that these young men receive from micro celebrity.
Yeah, and I think that that kind of Chief Keef narrative is the one that's really seductive that we all think about, and I thought about for far too long when I began this project. And I think that it's an important one, and I think that it's one of the ones that many of these young people enter into this world, the kind of drill music world, pursuing. Right, Dr. Dre is going to come into my neighborhood. He's going to see my YouTube videos. He's going to scoop me out. This is my upward mobility. I'm bringing my boys with me. I'm moving my mom into the suburbs. And it's a long shot, and they know it's a long shot. But I think once they begin to amass some popularity online, micro celebrity, right? Micro celebrity as opposed to like celebrity, micro celebrity, that like we're talking about, a niche following. Oftentimes it's kind of spatialized and local, it's in their neighborhood. Once they start amassing micro celebrity, a whole other set of processes begin, a whole other set of rewards, daily, seemingly mundane but non-trivial rewards begin, which I argue makes it harder and harder to leave this, and actually pulls guys further and further into, hey, the more that I exaggerate the kind of racialized stereotypes of my neighborhood, right, the more likes I can get. And those rewards are particularly profound, and this has to do with those stakes of digital disadvantage, are particularly profound for this set of young men who are hyper demonized. They're told at every step of the turn, you're a menace to society, you're worthless, you're never going to amount to anything, almost to the point of like, if you were not on this earth, the earth would be better. And this is where I think that like digital social media give this particular population, I would argue, like a historically unprecedented vehicle for being told over and over and over, you are worthy, you are special, you have an impact on people's lives, you are a contributor. Um, and they can measure it with likes and follows and views. Like the data analytics are quite literally set up to see how many times people like you. And so I think like those emotional rewards are huge. I tell a story in the book about a young man named Junior who had been kicked out of his house by his mom. He had done some dirt. He was on probation. He was living homeless. He was living in an apartment stairwell. He was living in the back of this like Pontiac sedan that was parked out in front of this apartment building. When I saw him, he was often wearing the same same clothing. I mean, this young man was in one of the most difficult situations, like I could possibly imagine a young person encountering. And his mom somehow on a whim like invites him to go to Walmart with her, help her carry some groceries. And they're like in line at Walmart, and this young woman, this teenager, walks up to him and is just like ecstatic, as though she's seen like a celebrity, and tells him that he's amazing and his music's great and he's an inspiration. And she begs him to take a selfie, and she begs him for a hug. And his mom, this young man's mom, sees this, and he reported to me after this trip to Walmart that this was one of the first times in his life that he remembers his mom saying that she was proud of him, right? So there's this way in which online micro celebrity transfers directly offline and gives these young men these new feelings that they've never experienced before. And I don't know about you, I have never been recognized in public, and no one's ever like begged me for a selfie in public. But these guys, it happens to
No.
them all the time. Like for this research, I traveled with them all around the country because they would actually have people fly them to their city to spend time with them, to appear on their social media, to teach them about how to be hood, which is a whole other thing. But we'd
Yes.
be in places, we'd be in like Atlanta, like standing out in front of a motel, and like people would drive up and they'd be like, "Oh my God, you're the Corner Boys, you're the Corner Boys." They'd start playing their music and dancing and exchange phone numbers. And that's never happened to me. So I can only imagine how seductive that is for like a 17-year-old moving through the world, who's been told at every other turn that they're worthless.
I agree. I mean, that story of, was it Junior or AJ?
Junior, yeah.
Yeah. And his mother in the Walmart. One, there's this kind of broader framework of like, these young men have their humanity seen finally, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the ability again to leverage that type of celebrity into something so basic as your mother feeling proud of you. It's not to say that his mother didn't love him,
Right.
but her ability to articulate, "I feel proud of you" at that moment. It was a very touching part of the book.
Yeah.
But it leads me to another part of the book, or an absence in the book. And
Yes. I'm
you
eager to
knew this
hear
was coming.
hear this
You
from
knew
you.
this was
Yes,
coming.
of course.
Yes, which is just there is a gender analysis, right? In the
Yes.
sense of masculinity, but the absence of women in this book, or at least their peripheral positioning. The mothers, the girlfriends,
Yeah.
the white women who want an exotic relationship.
Right.
It's all secondary. And I'm sure you could say to me, look, I could write a whole book on that. But it sounded like also in the author's notes that it was just difficult to have access to those women. But you knew they were missing. So I don't know. What do you want to say about this?
Oh boy, yeah. No, this is. I mean, Kathy, I love that you brought this up, and I knew you were going to bring this up because this should be brought up. And there is both a whole other book I could write about, and there's also a whole book I can't write about it. And the answer I'm about to give you, I myself find a little unsatisfying, and it's one that I kick myself about. And I think in this book, we see women through the eyes of these young men, first and foremost. And I think on one hand, I'm glad that we do, and on one hand, I think it's a glaring absence. On one hand, I think for me, it was really important to understand how these young men see women within the broader ecology of, say, fans, right? This is like a big deal that, one of the things that's really important with micro celebrity, sure, you get the love and affection from your mom, but it also leads a lot of these young men to kind of feel on guard, as though the kind of mundane relationships, like a romantic relationships, are somehow driven by ulterior motives, that this person just likes me because of my micro celebrity, right? And so I think, if we're thinking about how digital social media changes the ways that people interact offline in their communities, I think that this is important. At the same time, right, we see women through the eyes of young men.
Yes.
And there is a, my answer to this is that, like, there is in fact like a pragmatic reason why this happened, and you put your finger on some of it, and I write about this in the author's note. Um, wow, it was really, really difficult to get one-on-one private time with the young women in these young men's lives, in large part because often what that looked like, and I failed one time, and I made a big mistake, and I decided not to make this mistake again. I wanted so badly to sit down with girlfriends, and to sit down. There's a group, you alluded to them. There's a group of white women who come into Chicago in the summers to sleep with young men making drill. Like, they find them online, they're fascinated with these kind of ghetto tropes, and so they want to bed down like a real gangster. And so they start FaceTiming them, and they have kind of FaceTime sex, and then they come into town and they wine and dine them and put them up in hotels. This kind of new form of sex work, as I talk about it.
It's like a sex tourism, another form of sex tourism.
Another form of sex tourism, yes. And I tried, I will say, as hard as I think I could have possibly tried to get these women's numbers, to contact these women, to sit down with these women. And you know, for as a field worker, it's like, you know, going up to a young man like, hey man, I'm really interested in like what this woman thinks of you, right? Like, I'm really interested in like what she's really seeing in you in terms of, I mean, I wouldn't put it this way, but like that's you know, me explaining, I want to understand, like, how does she see you? Which is a kind of absurd question to ask, I think, of a person involved in a relationship. I don't think I would be able to go up to one of my friends and ask them like, hey man, like, I want to go talk to your girlfriend to ask, you know, how, you know, what she thinks about you. I found that awkward, and then also they found it very awkward that I would want to somehow spend some like one-on-one time with the women that they were romantically involved in, and they were like, no, absolutely not. Like, I'm not gonna give you her number. I think one, there we went back and forth quite a bit, you know, like there was quite a bit of kind of jockeying about like issues of desirability, issues of status. I mean, I'm coming into these young men's lives as a professor with a car and more financial resources, and for them, like, and they articulated as much, like, they're not going to give me the number of a person who they're sleeping with currently and they're romantically involved with. And so that was really difficult. And there was one instance where I was text messaging with one of the young men's girlfriends, and this didn't go over well whatsoever. And it's like, I swear, man, it's just for research. It's just for research. And it's like, that doesn't necessarily fly. And so I think, you know, there's this one chapter in the book that is very much, you know, centered on women, or it's not centered on women, but it has like Chad, it has kind of the sex tourism, it has their relationship with churches. And this is the chapter of the book that really makes me the most uncomfortable. And so I think what you see there is me trying to lean, probably that's the chapter that probably leans the most heavily kind of on theoretically, right? I'm trying to lean on bell hooks to give us some kind of, give me some kind of language to write about this, precisely because of my own acknowledgement that, like, whoo, I'm writing about these women, but they're represented, you know, not in their own words, like the men in this book are, but certainly through the tales that these men give me. So yeah, this is, I don't know, this is a conversation. I would love to hear from you, like your thoughts, or like what does one do in that situation?
Right. I mean, a couple of different things. One is, I was a little surprised you didn't do more in terms of thinking about masculinity, right? How it gets performed, the racial context, the long history of a kind of Black masculine performance. But, you know, we have a book. We can't do it all. So I understand that. The second thing is, there is, I felt like at times more depth, or at least more time given to these white women who are the sexual tourists, and you use bell hooks to frame this, and then the kind of, I would say, sporadic appearances of Black women throughout the book, right? Somebody's mother, but we don't really get much about the mother. Even we don't get their sense of who their mother is, or girlfriends who are sometimes named, sometimes not, clearly mothers of their children. And we get very little understanding of what those relationships are like, how they are wonderful at moments and fraught at others, right there. So it seemed to me there might have been other ways to provide a little more complexity to the women in the book, in particular the Black women in the book.
Yeah.
But you know, again, when when the movie version of this comes out, right? You'll say you'll say, let's hire Kathy for the screenplay. And she,
yeah. No, I mean, I think this is certainly not the first time I'm thinking about that. And what's interesting is that, there's multiple ways to think about these projects, right? Like we can think about them as like a discrete project in a book, or we can think about them more broadly. And it just so happens that I was feeling this for quite a while. And I, in my interactions with moms, in my interactions with sisters, in my interactions with girlfriends, there was a story that is much longer, deeper, more important than I think one that I could have possibly done justice to in this book. And in fact, I have this new book project that I'm working on now, which is what I'm using this MacArthur money for, which is actually centered on moms, girlfriends, and sisters. My hope is to come back to Chicago as soon as this pandemic is over, and it's really about the ways in which women in these spaces are carrying so much of the weight for these young men, and carry the weight, I think, is like a really apt metaphor, especially weight being a gun, and the weight, the kind of emotional trauma, and that I think is, I mean, I don't need to tell this to you, but that I think is just like, holy moly, for urban sociologists and sociologists of violence is absent, right? That, like, I actually think that not absent.
This is not my field. One, I'm not sure it's absent, but two, I would. This is just a little warning, which is, and not a warning. Insight. First of all, it's going to be a great book, but two, the way in which they're positioned, mothers, sisters, girlfriends, wives, maybe, right? The center is still these young men. And the question becomes, what's the flip side of their lives that, of course, is about caretaking, because that's what women do, and in particular, Black women, in particular, poor women. But how do they manifest themselves outside of centering young men, and how do you, as a researcher, right, pursue those questions when your orientation, of course, is probably these young men, since that's where you spent so much time. Before you answer that, because we don't have let's talk offline.
Yes,
I want to ask you a little bit, because we don't have a lot of time left, about methodology. Well, actually, there's so many things I want to ask you about. I wanted to ask you.
I want to continue talking about that.
I know about digital slumming, and I feel like people need to hear the Chad story, which was just like, can you do it in a minute? It was like outrageous. I found myself laughing, like, are you kidding me?
I would have laughed if it wasn't so perverse and exploitative. So one of the things that happens with these young men as they become more popular, they start to get offers from people around the country who want to fly them out to their city to kind of, boost up their own clout, this person's clout and Instagram fame. And in the book, I spent quite a bit of time talking about this young man, Chad, who lives in Beverly Hills, a young man, Junior, one of these drill rappers in Chicago, he hit him up on Facebook. And I'm forgetting the exact numbers. He gave him, I think, like an $800 deposit, bought him a ticket to fly to Beverly Hills for a week or so. And I accompanied Junior to Chad's visit, and Chad spends the entire time. It's like this weird, really icky cultural exchange where Chad,
cultural appropriation.
Yes, it's a cultural appropriation, I think, posed as kind of a cultural exchange, right? So like Chad feels like he's teaching Junior about like what it's like to be a rich white person in Beverly Hills. And then from Junior, he gets right to ping him with questions about, you name it, like what the hood is like, what it's like having sex with Black women, how to roll a blunt, how to drink lean, how to shoot people. So, and this is all kind of the in between of what he's supposed to be there for, which is to appear, say, in a music video with Chad that Chad has made, or to appear in Chad's Instagram. And it's all kind of like the politics of clout online, that like by linking himself to like a real authentic driller, then Chad can then kind of boost his own, metrics and likes and clicks and popularity.
To me, it also spoke to this, when people read the book, they'll see this kind of larger economy or ecology um, of drilling, right? So it's the drill rapper, there's the shooter, it's the crew, as you talk about his boys, but then there are bloggers and videographers and the Chads of the world. And there's a whole kind of economy to this that I think people will at least need to be reminded of when they read the book. I mean, you do this so that it's not just a story about young Black men making what we might say, or some people might say, are bad decisions that fall into stereotypes and perpetuate those stereotypes, right? There are all kinds of incentives throughout this system for them to do that work, and all of these people who depend on them doing that work. Would you agree with that assessment?
Absolutely, absolutely. One of the ways that I've talked about this in the book, and I think it's a helpful way to think about it, is that if these young men are making this content, but there's a whole lot of things we can think about the digital divide. There's a whole lot of things they can't do, right? So, I mean, it takes a certain amount of resources to like curate a really great YouTube page, or it takes a certain amount of resources to do the kinds of things that you do need to like really set yourself apart from other folks. Even though the means of production have been democratized, it doesn't mean, right, that this is even. And so there's, say, a really great example I think is illustrates this really well, is that like the YouTube channels that are out there that have thousands and thousands of subscribers, that if you can get your video onto these YouTube pages, they will then get disseminated onto a whole lot more screens. And so drill rappers will actually, they'll make their content and then they have to sell it, like quite literally give these YouTube channel owners money to put their video on. So now they've given up their content. The rights now belong to the YouTube channel. And then the channel owner is able to use the Google AdSense monetization to monetize their website. And so then the channel owner is now getting monthly checks from Google. And these things are being run by, they're being run by guys in like New Jersey. There's a really popular one being run by guys in the UK. And so it really makes us, and I think my big point with this is it really makes us question, or like, who in fact is driving the continual production of, say, videos of guys dancing around with guns, right? That yes, these guys with the guns in the video are making the content, but in large part, they're making it for a market, right? Like they're making the content that they know that YouTube channel owner wants and has asked them for, right? And will publicize precisely because it gets people panicked and they click on his YouTube page and they share his YouTube page, and he gets the metrics. And so I kind of go piece by piece through all the different folks in this ecology. I think for an intentional reason, which is to kind of like put us all on notice. But I will say that, like, boy, as it really puts me in this difficult position that I'm having a hard time dealing with, right? Which is the same thing happens every time I share this work, every time I share my book with folks, every time I talk with a reporter. The next time I chat with them, they say, "Oh my gosh, I went down this rabbit hole watching drill music videos. I couldn't stop watching." And then I showed my partner, and then I showed like my boss. And it's just like, through my work, like how do I wrestle with the fact that I too, right, am driving the kinds of metrics that then feed back down to the ground level that these guys are then trying to satisfy. And I guess what I can think about is like, maybe it's kind of like a Trojan horse, not to like make myself more important than it actually is, but like, okay, you clicked on those videos, but at the same time, perhaps like you're getting this other kind of narrative and reality about the young folks there. And at the same time, you're, for what it's worth, right, questioning your own kind of participation in this phenomenon that I'm trying to spell out.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. I mean, we don't have full control, but in the book, you are trying to lead us somewhere. You're providing a much more nuanced understanding of drill music and that ecology and market. You're giving us a more complex understanding of these young Black men, right? And you give us in the end a few, I would say, policy interventions that we might pursue. We have probably 1 minute left, but I want to make sure you get a chance to say, you know, here are 1 or 2 interventions that we might pursue that could change the calculus and the willingness of these, or the need for these young men to engage in this kind of online
Sure, yeah.
attention economy through drill music.
No, and I wish we had more than a minute because I wanted to get into a conversation with you about youth organizing and like what role these young men might play in it.
Well, I thought that was perfect what you said, and yes, they are content producers that would be relevant to that population. That's exactly right.
Yeah. So on this, and it's something that I think I've gotten more excited about, but I think it's an idea that I want to be in more conversation with more folks around it to think through it even more critically. Is that I think that once we shift thinking about these young men as like gang affiliated people or as, you know, some other kind of master status, if we can at least kind of complicate the way we think about them and also center the fact that they are artists and creatives, and honestly, what I like to say, like, they are winning the attention economy. And if we think about them as like people who have honed skills and perspectives to win the attention economy, that gives us a reason to think of them as like serious assets. You know, I am fond of thinking about the kind of New Deal programs that employed unemployed artists to do all kinds of things like that are civically engaged, whether it's like artists are beautifying infrastructure, or historians and writers are writing oral histories and capturing kind of like the American culture for better or for worse. But like, what if we thought about like a massive New Deal set of programs? It might not even necessarily have to be federal, but even we can think at a local scale of like what kind of added value, and I think it's a large added value, would we have if we like let these young folks do their work in ways that we really need. And I think about like the pandemic and the election.
Yeah.
like so many of us and the state is losing the battle in the attention economy, and it's like these guys are winning the attention economy. If we want to battle misinformation, if we want to disseminate information, whether it's public health information or voting information, you name it, I actually think that these young men provide such a key and overlooked vehicle for doing so. And so I think that's maybe the kind of policy, if there's a concrete policy kind of suggestion in the book, it's that one, that once we rethink who these people are, who these young men are, we can rethink like what their role could possibly be in bettering society.
I'm so sorry we are ending this conversation. It's been, you know, vibrant and provocative, and really making me think about how we want to do our work and the absences in our work, all of those things. This is a terrific piece of work. Thank you, Forrest, for sharing it with the world. Thank you for the conversation, and thanks to the Chicago Humanities Festival for allowing us to be in conversation about this work. So congratulations.
Thank you, Kathy.